Three men walked into Harlem with one job. Clean, simple, final. They left with something nobody sent them there to find a reason to stay alive. Spring came late to Harlem in 1952. Not the calendar kind of late. The calendar said April, but the cold had stayed past its welcome, the way certain men do, and the people of 116th Street had learned long ago not to trust what a calendar told them. They trusted what they felt, what they saw, what the street told them when it changed its breathing. And in the first week of April 1952, the street had changed its breathing. You have to understand what 116th Street was before you can understand anything else. It was not just a street, not just an address. It was a circulatory system, the vein through which Harlem's real life moved, not the life that newspapers wrote about, not the jazz clubs the white magazines photographed. The other life, the one that kept the lights on when the official economy had already decided Black Harlem didn't deserve lights. By 7 in the morning, the numbers runners were already moving. Young men 15, 16, some younger walking routes so familiar their feet knew the turns before their eyes did. They carried slips of paper folded into their palms, moving through hallways and up staircases and into the back rooms of barber shops and beauty parlors and corner groceries. They moved the way water moves, without announcing themselves, without stopping. The numbers. That was the economy inside the economy. A penny bet, a nickel, sometimes a dime for the ones who felt lucky or desperate, and in Harlem in 1952, those two conditions often wore the same face. The winning number came from the last 3 digits of the day's total mutual handle. At a racetrack, a number nobody could fix, a number the whole neighborhood would know by afternoon. The payout was 600 to 1 on a penny. $6 back for 1 cent in. To a family living on $14 a week, that was not gambling. That was mathematics. That was survival, dressed up as hope. The men who ran the numbers understood this. The best of them, the ones who lasted, understood that they were not just running a racket. They were running a parallel economy for people the official economy had locked out. Banks wouldn't loan to them. Insurance companies wouldn't cover them. The city's legitimate financial infrastructure had looked at Harlem and made a decision. The numbers made a different decision. And at the center of all of it, not loudly, not visibly, but structurally, the way a building's foundation is never the part you see, was one man. But we'll get to him. First, understand the street. 116th, between Lenox and 7th Avenue, on a Tuesday morning in April 1952, had a specific texture. The smell of frying pork from the window of Mrs. Caldwell's ground-floor apartment. The same smell every morning since 1944. So reliable, it functioned as a clock. The sound of Mr. Delaney's metal trash cans being dragged across concrete, always at 7:15, always complaining about the cold. The barber shop that technically opened at 9, but whose owner, a man named Curtis with reading glasses perpetually perched on his forehead, was always unlocking the door at 7:40. Because he couldn't sit still in his own apartment. These were the rhythms. And the people of 116th Street were intimate with their rhythms, the way musicians are intimate with a song they've played 10,000 times. They didn't think about it. They just knew immediately, instinctively, when something was off tempo. The first sign had come 3 days earlier, a Tuesday. Around noon. 2 men had stood on the corner of 116th and Lenox for 40 minutes, not buying anything, not talking to anyone, not waiting for the bus. The bus stop was half a block east, and everyone knew it. They just stood, watching. They wore suits that fit correctly. That was the detail people noticed. Not flashy, not cheap. Correct. The kind of suits that came from people who had someone else buy their clothes for them. They were not from Harlem. This required no investigation, no conversation, no asking around. The people who lived on 116th Street had spent their entire lives developing a specific and precise skill, identifying who belonged and who didn't. It was not a social skill. It was a survival skill. The kind that gets passed down, not through words, but through the quality of attention a mother pays to a doorway, through the way a father's posture changes when someone unfamiliar turns onto the block. After 40 minutes, the two men walked back toward the subway. Nobody followed them. Nobody needed to. By 12:45 that afternoon, 4 separate people had mentioned the two men in suits to 4 separate people. By 2 p.m., the information had traveled without phones, without urgency, without anything louder than a quiet word between neighbors 12 blocks in 3 directions. That was how 116th Street communicated. Not loudly, completely. The second sign came the following morning. A car, dark blue, parked on the east side of Lenox, engine off, for just under 2 hours. The driver never got out, never made a call, just sat behind the wheel with the brim of his hat low, facing the street, watching the morning do what the morning does. Curtis, the barber, noticed it at 7:40 when he unlocked his door. It was gone by 9:55. Curtis mentioned it to the first customer who sat in his chair. Not as alarm, as information. The way you mention weather. The way you mention a step that needs fixing before somebody trips on it. Car was parked out front again, Curtis said, running the comb through slow. Dark blue. Didn't recognize it. The customer, a man named Raymond, who ran 3 routes on the west side of the neighborhood, said nothing for a moment. Just looked at himself in the mirror. Same one as yesterday? Different plates, Curtis said. Same kind of quiet. Raymond left a $1 tip. He never left tips. He was out the door before Curtis had finished counting it. By Thursday morning, the information had reached the people it needed to reach, not through panic, not through confrontation, just through the street doing what the street does, breathing, circulating, sending signals the way a body sends signals when something is wrong inside it. Something was wrong inside it. 116th Street knew. It was waiting, now, to see what the man who kept its heart beating would do about it. 2 miles south, the same week, a different kind of room. There was a diner on Lenox Avenue called Mabel's. It had 11 tables, a counter with 8 stools, and a cook named Philip who had been frying eggs behind that same window since 1941. The coffee was strong enough to offend people who weren't from Harlem, and the pie sweet potato, Thursday through Saturday, only was the kind of thing men planned their weeks around. Mabel's opened at 6 in the morning. On the first Friday of April, 1952, at exactly 8:23 a.m., something happened in that diner that had nothing to do with food. But to understand what happened, you need to understand what the room looked like before it happened. 8 tables occupied, Philip behind the window, spatula moving. A woman in a yellow dress reading yesterday's paper at the counter. 2 transit workers eating fast before a shift. A retired postal worker named Gerald, who came every morning and ordered the same thing: oatmeal, black coffee, no conversation, and had done so for 6 years without variation. The diner had a specific sound. Forks on plates, steam from the coffee machine, the low register of the radio behind the counter playing something instrumental that nobody was really listening to. It was an ordinary Friday morning. Then the door opened. Nobody announced anything. Nobody stood up. But the room shifted. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of shift you'd notice if you were from somewhere else, if you didn't know the room's normal register. But to anyone who knew Mabel's, to anyone who had been coming here long enough to understand its rhythms, the change was immediate and unmistakable. The transit workers didn't stop eating, but they slowed down. Gerald didn't look up from his oatmeal, but his spoon paused for just a half second before continuing. Philip behind the window glanced up once, not in alarm, not in greeting, just in acknowledgement, then went back to his eggs. The woman in the yellow dress turned a page of her newspaper. That was all. That was everything. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson Bumpy, to everyone who knew him, which was everyone, walked to the second table from the back and sat down facing the door. He was 47 years old, medium height, solid, without being large. He wore a dark gray suit that had been pressed that morning, and a white shirt with the top button fastened, no tie. His hat, a black felt fedora, brim level, not tilted, came off when he sat and went onto the table beside him without ceremony. He had a scar on the left side of his forehead. Old. From before most people in this room had known him, he picked up the menu. He had been eating at Mabel's since 1946. He had never once needed to look at the menu, but he always picked it up, held it for a moment, set it down. Nobody who knew him ever asked why. Nobody who knew him needed to. A waitress named Loretta, 23 years old, 8 months into the job, still learning the room's language, brought coffee without being asked, set it down carefully, did not speak, moved back toward the counter with the practiced stillness of someone who had been told, gently but once, how things worked at the second table from the back. Bumpy wrapped both hands around the cup, looked at the door, looked at the window facing Lenox Avenue, looked at nothing in particular for a moment, the way men do when they are thinking about something they have no intention of discussing. Then he drank his coffee. The man who came in 4 minutes later was named Clarence. He was one of Bumpy's, not in the way that required explanation, just in the way that certain men occupy certain orbits, and everyone understands the physics of it without needing a diagram. Clarence was 31, had been running the east side of the numbers operation since 1949, reliable in the way that mattered, not flashy reliable, not looking for recognition reliable, just present, accurate, quiet. He sat down across from Bumpy without greeting. Bumpy did not look up immediately. That was not coldness. That was rhythm. Clarence knew the rhythm. He waited. After a moment, Bumpy set his cup down. "How many?" he said. 3 days running," Clarence said. "Different people. Same kind of watching." Bumpy said nothing. 2 on foot Tuesday. Car on Wednesday. Foot again yesterday. Different men. Bumpy looked at the window. Outside, Lenox Avenue moved the way it always moved, bodies and buses, and the particular organized chaos of a neighborhood that runs on its own time. A woman pushing a cart, 2 boys from the building on the corner, throwing something back and forth that glinted when it caught the light. "How far south did they go?" Bumpy said. "Didn't cross 110th. A pause. They're not from the precinct," Clarence said. "I know they're not from the precinct," Bumpy said. Not sharp, not dismissive, just clarifying that certain things did not require saying. Clarence understood. He reached for the coffee Loretta had placed in front of him. She had done it without being asked, without approaching the table during the conversation, managing somehow to set the cup down in the 3-second window between sentences. Clarence noticed this. He didn't say anything about it either. Some rooms train people well. What Bumpy did not do in the next 4 minutes is as important as what he did. He did not make a call. He did not send Clarence anywhere. He did not ask for names or descriptions beyond what he'd already been given, or any of the other pieces of information that a less experienced man would have immediately demanded. He finished his coffee. He ordered breakfast eggs, toast, no meat, the same thing he always ordered. He ate slowly. He looked at the door twice more while eating, not nervously, the way a man looks at a door when he is cataloging something, filing it, assigning it its proper weight, and placing it in the correct part of his thinking, where it will wait until he needs it. When he was finished, he wiped his mouth with the paper napkin, set it beside the plate, looked at Clarence. "Let them watch," he said, "for now." That was the instruction. 3 words. Clarence left 3 minutes later, paid for his own coffee at the counter, nodded to Philip through the window, walked out onto Lenox Avenue, and turned north without looking back. Bumpy stayed another 20 minutes. He read part of a newspaper someone had left on the next table. He exchanged a brief word with Gerald, the retired postal worker, about nothing consequential, the kind of brief word that exists only to acknowledge a man's presence, to say, "I see you here," without making anything of it. Then he put on his hat, adjusted the brim level, the way it always was, stood, left $4 on the table for a meal that cost $1.40, walked out, On the sidewalk outside Mabel's, a boy of about 12 was sitting on an overturned crate, doing something with a piece of rope. He looked up when the door opened. Bumpy glanced at him, reached into his jacket pocket, produced a folded bill, nobody close enough to see the denomination, and held it out without breaking stride. The boy took it. Bumpy kept walking. The boy looked at the bill, looked at the direction Bumpy had gone, went back to his rope. This was not a story the boy told to impress anyone. This was just a Tuesday, a Friday, a morning in April that looked like every other morning until you knew what was underneath it. This was how Harlem knew Bumpy Johnson, not from speeches, not from newspaper stories, not from the things that happen when cameras are present, from the second table from the back at Mabel's, from 3 words delivered over finished eggs, from a folded bill passed to a boy on a crate who didn't need to ask who it was from the way a room slowed down just slightly, just enough when the door opened. That was the man. That was all you needed to know. 6 blocks north. That same afternoon, a different kind of quiet. The room had no windows. That was intentional. It was located above a dry goods importing business on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan, a business that had been importing dry goods since 1931 and would continue importing dry goods until 1971, at which point it would close quietly and without explanation. Its records showing nothing unusual across 4 decades of operation, except consistently modest profit margins and an unusually high frequency of after-hours meetings. The room above it had a rectangular table, 8 chairs, an ashtray at each place setting, a single overhead light with a pull chain that someone had replaced with a longer cord sometime in the 1940s so that the man who always sat at the head of the table, a man with very short arms and very long patience, could reach it without standing. It was the kind of room that made decisions, not the kind of room that announced them. April 3rd, 1952. A Thursday evening. The men who gathered were not the kind of men whose names appeared in newspapers. That was a deliberate and carefully maintained condition of their existence. The men whose names appeared in newspapers were, in the architecture of this particular world, several layers removed from this room. Those men attended events, gave to charities, had their photographs taken at the openings of restaurants and the christenings of boats. The men in this room did not attend events. They caused them, 5 of them tonight. Not all of the commission. This was not that kind of meeting. This was a working meeting, the kind where the table had coffee instead of wine, and nobody's driver waited outside because nobody had arrived by car. The man at the head of the table, the one with the long cord, was called Sal by people who had known him long enough to call him anything. He was 61 years old, had been in this room, or rooms exactly like it, since he was 34. He had outlasted 4 wars, 2 federal investigations, and 17 men who had at various points believed they could replace him. He was not physically imposing. He had the face of a man who repaired watches precise, unhurried, attentive to small things. He had not raised his voice in 11 years. People who knew him considered this the most frightening thing about him. Harlem, said the man to Sal's left. His name was not important to this story. What was important was what he represented: a financial interest in the numbers operation that had been running above 110th Street since the late 1930s, an interest that had been, until recently, tolerated rather than contested. Harlem, Sal repeated. Not a question. An acknowledgement. The Johnson situation. A pause. The ashtray in front of Sal held a cigarette that had been burning for 2 minutes without being touched. He looked at it, decided against it, let it continue burning. Talk about it, he said. The man to his left opened a leather folder. Inside were numbers, columns of them, handwritten, which was itself a statement about how seriously this operation was taken. Nothing typed, nothing that could be subpoenaed and read into a record somewhere. The numbers told a story. The numbers said that the Harlem operation, the numbers racket above 110th Street, was generating somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 a week in gross revenue. The numbers said that the arrangement currently in place, a tithe, essentially paid upward through intermediaries to the men in this room, had been producing less than it should since 1949. Not dramatically less, not insultingly less, strategically less. "He's been skimming?" said the man across the table, a heavy-set man named Vincent who handled labor operations in Brooklyn and had opinions about everything. "Not skimming," said the man with the folder. "Redirecting. A distinction. Into what? Community things, bail funds, a church on 118th, a few businesses he wants to survive." A pause. "And some of it, we think, into his own reserves." Vincent made a sound that was not quite a word. Sal said nothing. The cigarette finished burning itself out. The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes. It covered 3 years of financial records, 2 failed renegotiations conducted through intermediaries, and 1 direct message sent to Bumpy Johnson in the fall of 1951, a message that had been received, acknowledged through the appropriate channel, and then addressed in the way that Bumpy Johnson addressed most things he had decided not to comply with, which was to say, it had been addressed with silence and a marginal adjustment that satisfied the letter of the request while completely ignoring its spirit. Sal had read the response such as it was and said nothing at the time. He was saying nothing now, too, but the quality of his nothing had changed. "The problem," said the man with the folder, closing it, "is that he's not just running numbers anymore. He let that sit for a moment. He's running the neighborhood, the whole infrastructure. You take him out, and you don't just take out a man, you take out the thing that keeps 40 blocks from becoming completely ungovernable. That's his strategy," Vincent said. "That's correct," said the man with the folder. "That is his strategy." Another silence. It was the kind of silence that fills a room when men who are accustomed to having answers find themselves in the presence of a question they haven't fully solved yet. Sal looked at the ceiling, looked at the table, looked at nothing. "He made himself necessary," he said finally. "Not with admiration, not with anger, with recognition, the way one chess player acknowledges a move that has significantly complicated the board." The debate that followed, and it was a debate, a real one, conducted in low voices and occasionally fractured by Vincent's habit of speaking with his hands, lasted another 20 minutes. There were those who argued for continued negotiation, for a different kind of intermediary, for patience. There were those who argued that patience had been the strategy for 3 years and had produced nothing except a progressively more entrenched situation. Sal listened to both sides the way he always listened, completely, without indicating which direction he was leaning, his face doing nothing that would give anyone in the room an advantage. When both sides had finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Find me 3 men who know how to have a conversation." The phrasing was deliberate. Everyone in the room understood it. A conversation did not mean what it meant in other rooms. In this room, at this table, with this man delivering those words in that tone, a conversation meant an ending, a permanent one, the kind that resolved a situation without the need for further discussion. "Not soldiers," Sal said, before anyone could speak. "I want professionals, men who can walk into Harlem, conduct their business, and walk out without the neighborhood knowing they were ever there." "A pause. The neighborhood always knows," said the man with the folder, quietly, as a fact, not a challenge. Sal looked at him. "Then find me men who can do it before the neighborhood has time to react." 3 names were discussed, not said aloud at the table, written on a single sheet of paper that was passed to Sal, read once, folded in half, and placed in his jacket pocket. The meeting ended at 9:47 p.m. The men left at intervals, 3 minutes between each departure. Standard practice, the kind of discipline that becomes habit so deeply embedded it requires no thought. Sal left last. He stood at the table alone for a moment after the others had gone, looking at the ashtray, the dead cigarette, the ring left by his coffee cup on the wood. He thought about the man above 110th Street. He thought about a man who had made himself the load-bearing wall of 40 blocks of Harlem and then dared anyone to swing a sledgehammer. He turned off the light, pulled the long cord, walked down the stairs. Outside, Mulberry Street was quiet. A cat crossed the gutter. A window above a restaurant was lit orange against the April dark. Sal walked north to where his car was waiting. He did not look back at the building. He didn't need to. The decision had been made. 3 days later, above 110th Street, the men who didn't belong had come back. To understand what was at stake, you have to go back further than 1952. You have to go back to what Harlem was before it became what people think it was. In 1910, Harlem was an accident, a real estate accident. Specifically, a speculative building boom had overproduced housing in Upper Manhattan, too many apartment buildings constructed too quickly for a market that hadn't materialized the way developers had predicted. The buildings sat empty. The developers, facing ruin, made a calculation. They opened the buildings to black tenants. Not out of principle, not out of decency, out of arithmetic. What followed was one of the largest voluntary migrations in American urban history. Black families moving up from the South, from Georgia, from the Carolinas, from Virginia, and black families already in Manhattan moving uptown from the Tenderloin and San Juan Hill neighborhoods that had been their previous addresses. They came because Harlem had space, because Harlem had housing with actual plumbing and actual heat, because Harlem, for a specific window of time, was offering something that almost nowhere else in America was offering black families in 1910, a place to be. By 1920, Harlem was the largest black urban community in the United States. By 1930, it was something else entirely. The Depression arrived in Harlem 3 years before it arrived everywhere else. That was not a metaphor. That was economics. The industries that employed black workers, domestic service, longshore work. The lower rungs of manufacturing contracted first and contracted hardest when the economy began its descent. White workers, displaced from higher positions, moved down into jobs that had previously been available to black workers. The displacement was systematic and nearly total. By 1932, Harlem's unemployment rate was somewhere between 40 and 50%, depending on who was counting and whether they were counting honestly. Banks had already decided that Harlem was not a lending community. That decision had been made quietly, institutionally, without announcement, simply through the consistent and documented practice of refusing mortgages and business loans to black applicants regardless of their financial standing. The term for it would come later. The practice was already fully operational. Insurance companies had made similar decisions. The city's welfare infrastructure, such as it was designed for and administered by people who did not consider Harlem's residents a priority population. The official economy had, in every practical sense, declined to participate in Harlem. So Harlem built its own. This is the part that history books handle carefully, when they handle it at all. Because the economy that Harlem built to replace the one that had excluded it was not entirely legal. It could not be entirely legal. Legal commerce required access to capital, access to banking, access to the licensing and regulatory infrastructure that was administered by a city government that was, in 1932, not particularly interested in facilitating black economic development in Upper Manhattan. So, the economy that worked, the one that actually kept families fed, that actually kept lights on and rent paid, and children in shoes operated in the gaps, in the barber shops, in the beauty parlors, in the back rooms of groceries, in the folded slips of paper that moved through hallways and stairwells every morning before most of the city had finished its first cup of coffee. The numbers. A penny could become $6. A nickel could become 30. On a good week, with the right number, with the right runner, with the right calculation, a family could cover a month of groceries from a $2 investment. This was not crime in the way that word gets used when people want to dismiss something. This was infrastructure. By 1935, the numbers operation in Harlem was generating an estimated $50 million a year in total wagers. $50 million. Moving through a community that the official financial system had decided was not worth lending $50,000 to. And because it was the community's own money, moving through the community's own channels, employing the community's own young men as runners and collectors and intermediaries because the entire apparatus was black-owned, black-operated, and black-serving it did something that no external economic force in Harlem's history had managed to do. It stayed. It did not extract and leave. It circulated. The runner spent his wages at the grocer on the corner. The grocer paid his landlord. The landlord, if he was from the neighborhood, if he was the kind of landlord that the neighborhood's informal social contract encouraged him to be kept rents at a level that did not simply drain every dollar back out through the ceiling. It was imperfect. It was exploitable. There were men inside it who were not operating with Harlem's interests anywhere near the front of their minds. But it was there, and it was functioning. Bumpy Johnson understood this in a way that was not intellectual. He had grown up in Charleston, South Carolina, had come to Harlem in 1919 at 14 years old, with a history of fighting and a brain that his teachers, the few who had paid attention, had described in terms that were meant as warnings but functioned as maps. Too smart for his own good was the version they said to his face. What they meant was smart enough to see systems, smart enough to understand how things actually work beneath the surface of how they're presented, smart enough to look at a structure and identify immediately where the weight was really being held. He had looked at Harlem's numbers operation in the late 1920s and seen exactly what it was. Not a racket, a bank, an informal, unregulated, technically illegal bank that was serving a community no legitimate bank would touch. And, like any bank, it required stability to function. It required people to trust that their money would be handled correctly, that the payouts would come when they were supposed to come, that the men running the operation were not simply extracting and disappearing. It required, in other words, accountability. That was the role Bumpy had moved into, not loudly, not through declaration, but through the consistent and visible practice of operating with a standard that the community could measure against. When a runner shorted a customer, the customer got made whole. When a dispute arose over a payout, it got resolved not always in the customer's favor, but always through a process that felt like adjudication rather than dismissal. When the 1,935 Harlem riots broke out sparked by a rumor, inflamed by years of economic desperation and police brutality, consuming 6 city blocks over 2 days, Bumpy had walked the streets. No weapon visible, just walking, talking to people, listening to people, standing between groups who were moving toward each other with the specific energy that precedes something irreversible. He had not stopped the riots. No single man stops a riot, but people had stopped, breathed, looked at him, and in several specific locations, on several specific blocks, the momentum had shifted just enough, just long enough, for something worse not to happen. The police had been watching from behind their lines. They did not move to arrest him. That was a calculation too. They knew what he was doing. They knew what would happen to their lines if he stopped doing it. This was what the men from Mulberry Street did not understand. They had looked at the numbers. They had seen revenue. They had seen a man controlling a financial operation in 40 blocks of Upper Manhattan and assessed him the way they assessed everything as a resource to be taxed or a problem to be removed. They had not asked the question that mattered. What happens to those 40 blocks if you remove him? Not as a moral question, as a practical one. What fills the space? What holds the structure? What keeps the informal economy functioning? The disputes adjudicated, the community's internal systems operational. What happens to a bank when you remove the only person the depositors trust? The men from Mulberry Street had not asked this question because they did not believe it was their question to ask. Harlem's stability was not their concern. Harlem's people were not their concern. The money was their concern. And this specific, catastrophic failure of imagination was the thing that Bumpy Johnson had understood about them for 20 years. They saw the revenue. They did not see what the revenue was built on. They did not see that you could not separate the money from the man, from the community, from the trust, that it was all one thing, all weight-bearing, all connected in ways that a ledger column could not represent. They were sending 3 men to remove a load-bearing wall, and they had not once stopped to ask what the ceiling was made of. That same week, above 110th Street, the 3 men had already crossed the bridge. They came up from the subway at 116th and Lenox on a Wednesday morning, April 9th, 1952, 9:14 a.m. 3 men, single file through the turnstile, which meant nothing on its own. People come through turnstiles single file all day long in every subway station in New York City. But these 3 did it with a specific kind of spacing, not the casual, distracted spacing of men who happened to be traveling together. The precise, practiced spacing of men who have moved through public spaces as a unit before, who know, without discussing it, how far apart to stand so that they look like strangers while remaining within operational range of each other. Small thing, the kind of thing only certain people notice. On the platform that morning, 2 people noticed. Their names, as best as anyone in Harlem would later be able to reconstruct them, were as follows. The first, the one who came through the turnstile last and took the longest route to the stairs, went by Caruso. Whether this was a surname, a nickname, or something else entirely was never established with certainty. He was in his mid-40s, compact, the kind of physical economy that comes from decades of being paid to be efficient. His hands, when they were visible, were still. The second was taller, thin in the way that suggests not deprivation but discipline. He wore a brown coat that was slightly too warm for April, which meant either he hadn't checked the weather or he had something under it. He needed the coat to cover. His eyes moved constantly, not nervously, but professionally, the way a surveyor's eyes move, cataloging distances and positions without appearing to do so. The third was the youngest, late 30s, maybe 40. He had the look of a man who had once been handsome and had made a career decision that had gradually revised that assessment. A small scar below his left ear that was old enough to have faded to white. He walked with a very slight irregularity in his right step, not a limp, not something anyone who wasn't looking for it would catch. Just a fraction of a second's hesitation on the right foot. An old injury. Healed, but not completely forgotten by the body. They came up the stairs into the April light. Lenox Avenue received them the way Lenox Avenue received everything that didn't belong. In silence, with full attention, without acknowledgement. The first hour was reconnaissance. They were good at it. Better than the men who had come before them, the watchers in suits, the driver in the dark blue car. Those had been assessments, preliminary work. This was something more specific. They split up. Caruso walked south along Lenox, stopping once to buy a newspaper from a stand, standing with it open at the corner of 113th for 11 minutes before folding it and continuing. The tall one went east on 116th, walking the full block to 7th Avenue, standing outside a hardware store for several minutes, then turning back. The youngest went north, moving slowly, stopping to look in windows, eating something from a paper bag he'd produced from his coat pocket. They were mapping. Entry points, exit routes, the density of foot traffic, at what times, which blocks had storefronts with sight lines to the street and which were blind, where the police walked and how often, where the natural choke points were the places where a man could be approached without easy escape routes available. Professional work. The problem was the neighborhood. Harlem, in April of 1952, was not a place that missed things. This is not a romantic statement about community solidarity, though that was real. It is a precise statement about survival infrastructure. A neighborhood that has spent decades navigating police hostility, economic exclusion, and the attentions of organized crime interests from below 110th Street develops, out of sheer necessity, an observational apparatus that functions like a nervous system. Every block had its watchers. Not organized watchers. Not people who had been assigned positions or given instructions. Just people, women at windows, men on stoops, children whose play patterns covered the same 3 or 4 blocks every day who knew, with absolute intimacy, every face that belonged and every face that didn't. 3 men who moved like they moved did not go unregistered. The first report came at 9:31 a.m., 17 minutes after they'd come up from the subway. A woman named Estelle, who lived on the 3rd floor of a building on 115th, had watched Caruso walk past her window and mentioned it to her neighbor in the hallway 90 seconds later. Her neighbor's husband ran a route for Bumpy's operation. By 9:45, the information was in motion. By 10:20, 3 separate people had described 3 separate men to 3 separate members of Bumpy's network. By 11, someone had connected the descriptions. 3 men, moving independently, covering different sections of the same neighborhood, dressed correctly but not from here, watching without appearing to watch. The information assembled itself, the way information always assembled itself, on 116th Street, not through any central command, not through any organized intelligence operation, but through the simple and profound fact that in a community this tight, unusual things do not stay private for long. The 3 men met for lunch at a diner on 114th Street, not Mabel's. A different place, smaller, quieter, the kind of place that served food without commentary and minded its own business. They sat in a corner booth, ordered separately, spoke in low tones and infrequently, which in an ordinary diner would be unremarkable. In this diner, on this block, on this particular Wednesday, it was noted. The woman behind the counter, her name was Doris, and she had been running this counter since her mother retired in 1948, watched them the way she watched everything, without appearing to watch, refilling coffee when it needed refilling, keeping her movements to the section of the counter that gave her a natural angle to the corner booth. She heard very little of what they said. She heard enough. 2 words, specifically, that she caught during a moment when the diner had gone briefly quiet and the tall one had leaned forward slightly and spoken with more directness than the rest of the conversation had contained. Johnson was one of the words. The other word was a number, a street number. 116. Doris finished her shift at 2 o'clock. On her way home, she stopped to speak to a woman she had known since childhood, a woman whose son worked for a man she would not name directly, but whose address she had just heard discussed in a corner booth by 3 men she had never seen before and hoped never to see again. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. It was the most important 4 minutes of that Wednesday. By 3 p.m., Bumpy Johnson knew 3 things. He knew there were 3 of them. He knew they had spent the morning mapping his neighborhood. And he knew from the description of the youngest one, the one with the old injury in his right step, a description that matched a name, that matched a history, that one of Bumpy's people had encountered 7 years earlier. In a completely different context, he knew approximately who had sent them. He was sitting in the back room of a dry goods store on 117th Street when this last piece of information arrived. The man who delivered it, a thin, careful man named Otis, who had been with Bumpy since 1944, watched Bumpy receive it and waited for a reaction. There wasn't one, not the visible kind. Bumpy looked at the wall for a moment. Then he looked at his hands. Then he looked at Otis in the way that meant the conversation was almost over. "Are they staying uptown?" he said. "Hotel on 112th. Otis said. "Checked in this morning." Bumpy nodded. "A pause. Let them finish their maps," he said. Otis waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He left. Bumpy stayed in that back room for another 40 minutes. Alone. This was known because the man who kept the store a quiet, careful man named Arthur, who had learned over many years exactly when to be present and when to be completely unavailable, had stationed himself at the front of the building and had not heard any movement from the back room for the duration. What Bumpy was thinking during those 40 minutes, nobody could say with certainty. What he did when he came out was this. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his hat from the counter where he'd set it. He told Arthur that the back room had been useful, and he appreciated the quiet. Then he walked out onto 117th Street, turned east, and disappeared into the afternoon the way water disappears into ground completely, without leaving a visible path. The three men from Mulberry Street ate dinner that evening at the same diner on 114th. They did not know that by the time their food arrived, the man they had come to Harlem to find already knew their hotel, their general methodology, and the name of the man who had sent them. They thought they were watching. They did not know they had been seen on the first day, mapped on the second, and fully understood by the third. They ordered the special. They ate. They went back to their hotel on 112th Street, and somewhere above them, in the specific and total way that Harlem knows things before they happen, the street adjusted itself, made room, waited. The next morning, a different kind of quiet settled over 116th Street, the kind that comes before a decision has been made public, the kind that means someone already knows how it ends. April 10th, 1952, Thursday morning. M. Mars, a Mars NEM. Bumpy Johnson was awake before the street was. This was not unusual. He had slept in short intervals since his 20s, a habit formed in environments where long sleep was a liability, where the difference between a light sleeper and a heavy one had occasionally been the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. He had never fully unlearned it. Even now, in 1952, with the relative security of established position and loyal people on every block even now, he woke before the light and lay still for several minutes, listening to the building breathe around him. His apartment on 116th Street was 4 rooms, modest in a way that surprised people who expected otherwise. The furniture was good, but not excessive. Books on every available surface, not as decoration, not as statement, but because he read them, had always read them. Poetry, mostly. History. Occasionally philosophy, though he was privately skeptical of philosophers who had not been tested by anything more serious than a faculty disagreement. He dressed slowly, deliberately. This too was a habit, not vanity. Precision. The same reason a surgeon scrubs carefully before entering an operating room. Because what comes next requires you to be fully present, and the ritual of preparation is how you arrive there. White shirt, dark trousers, the gray jacket pressed the night before and hung on the back of the bedroom door where he could see it from the bed. He made coffee in the kitchen, stood at the window while it brewed, looked at 116th Street in the gray pre-dawn light. The street was almost empty. A milk truck making its rounds. A man, he recognized one of the older numbers runners, a man named Preston, who worked mornings only, and had done so for 15 years, moving along the far sidewalk with the measured pace of someone who had made this walk so many times it existed below the level of conscious thought. Bumpy watched Preston until he turned the corner, poured his coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and began to think about the 3 men from Mulberry Street. What he already knew, he had organized the previous night into a shape he could work with. 3 professionals, not soldiers. The distinction Sal had made in that windowless room on Mulberry Street, the distinction Bumpy did not know had been made, but had arrived at independently through the quality of what his people had reported. Soldiers moved differently. Soldiers from the organization, below 110th Street, moved through Harlem with a specific kind of entitlement, the entitlement of men who believed the geography belonged to them by right, who had never fully absorbed the information that above 110th Street, the physics were different. These 3 moved without entitlement. They moved with respect for the environment. Not respect for the people in it, that was a different thing, but respect for the environment as a system, as something that needed to be understood before it could be navigated. That told him something important. Whoever had sent them had thought carefully about the selection. That told him something else. The question that had occupied him for 40 minutes in Arthur's back room and for the shorter, sharper intervals of wakefulness through the night, was not the question most men in his position would have asked first. Most men would have asked, "How do I remove them?" Bumpy had asked, "Why these three?" Not as an idle question, as a structural one, because the answer to why these three contained information about the sender's current state of mind that was more valuable than anything the three men themselves could provide. The selection of an instrument tells you about the hand that chose it. Sal, and by this point, Bumpy was reasonably certain the instruction had originated with Sal, though through how many intermediary layers he couldn't yet confirm. Sal had specifically requested professionals, had specifically requested men who could operate in Harlem without triggering a response before the job was complete, which meant Sal was not, at this moment, trying to send a message. He was trying to solve a problem quietly. That was a crucial distinction. A man who wants to send a message sends soldiers and doesn't care much if the neighborhood sees. The visibility is the message. But a man who sends professionals, men specifically chosen for discretion, for the ability to operate without creating noise, that man wants the outcome without the attention. He wants the problem to simply stop existing one morning, without a story attached to it, without a reaction to manage. He was afraid of the reaction. He was afraid of what Harlem would do. Bumpy sat with his coffee and turned this over for a long time. Sal was afraid. Not of Bumpy Johnson specifically, or not only of Bumpy Johnson specifically. Sal was afraid of the 40 blocks, of the structure, of the thing Bumpy had built over 20 years that had made itself so integral to the neighborhood's functioning that removing it without care would be like pulling a thread from a fabric without knowing which thread was load-bearing. Bumpy had counted on this, had, in fact, deliberately constructed this over many years, not as a survival strategy, though it functioned as one, but because it was the right way to operate, because the numbers operation existed to serve the community, and a man who served the community well enough became something the community could not afford to lose, and a man the community could not afford to lose was a man even his enemies had to think twice about removing. This had always been the plan, not a spoken plan, not a written one, just a way of operating, consistently, over decades, that had produced this specific situation. 3 professionals in a hotel on 112th Street, sent specifically because their sender was not confident he could survive the consequences of something louder. Bumpy drank his coffee, almost smiled, but there was one piece of information he didn't have yet, and it was the piece that mattered most. He knew who the 3 men were, in general terms. He knew who had sent them, in approximate terms. He knew what they had been sent to do, which required no deduction at all. What he didn't know was the 3rd man, the youngest one, the one with the healed injury in his right step, the one whose description had matched a name that Otis had produced the previous afternoon, a name from 7 years ago, from a completely different context. A name that, if it was correct, changed the texture of this situation in a way that Bumpy needed to understand before he made any decisions. Because if this 3rd man was who Otis believed he was, then he was not simply a professional brought in from outside. He was a professional with a specific history, a history that included, 7 years earlier, a situation in a different city involving a different set of people. A situation that had ended in a way that had left this man with something beyond a healed injury in his right foot. It had left him with a debt, not to Bumpy directly, to someone connected to Bumpy, to someone whose name, if mentioned correctly, in the right context, would mean something to this man that no amount of money from Mulberry Street could immediately override. Bumpy needed to confirm this. He needed to be certain before he moved. He sent for Otis at 8 a.m. Otis arrived at 8:22. He came to the apartment directly. This was unusual, a sign that Bumpy wanted the conversation private, and sat at the kitchen table where Bumpy had been sitting since before dawn, the coffee cup replaced twice since 6:47. "The name you gave me yesterday," Bumpy said. "How certain are you?" Otis had clearly been thinking about this since the previous afternoon. He had the look of a man who had spent the night weighing something carefully and had arrived at a position he was prepared to defend but not overstate. 70%, Otis said. Bumpy nodded. This was Otis's honest number, which made it more useful than 100% from someone else. The foot, Bumpy said. Right side. Below the knee originally, they said. Healed wrong the first time. Otis paused. That's not the kind of thing two different men both have. A silence. What was the situation in 45? Bumpy said. Otis told him. It took 6 minutes. Bumpy did not interrupt once. He listened the way he always listened to information he had specifically requested completely, without the visible processing that most people do, the nodding and the expressions of comprehension, that signal reception. He simply received it, filed it, let it find its position in the larger structure of what he was assembling. When Otis finished, Bumpy was quiet for almost a full minute. Who else knows this? He said finally. About 45? 3 people that I know of. 2 of them are dead. Another silence. The third? Bumpy said. Otis looked at the table for a moment. That would be the man's mother, he said. She's still in Baltimore. What Bumpy did with this information, the sequence of quiet decisions that followed over the next 18 hours, was not witnessed by anyone in its entirety. It happened in pieces, across different locations, through different intermediaries, the way all of Bumpy's most important work happened. What is known is this. By Thursday evening, a message had been sent, not to Sal, not to any of the men in the room on Mulberry Street, to the youngest of the 3 professionals, the one with the healed injury, the one whose name Otis had been 70% certain about. The message was delivered through a channel so indirect, so many removes from Bumpy himself, that the 3 men in the hotel on 112th Street had no way of knowing it had come from him. The message was 4 words. Nobody who was present when the youngest man received it and read it would later describe his reaction in any detail. What they would say, when pressed, was that he read it twice, folded it, sat very still for a moment. Then he looked at the other 2 men in the room and said nothing, whatever the 4 words were, and this was debated for years afterward among the people who knew pieces of the story. They were enough, because the following morning, Friday, April 11th, the youngest man did something that no professional brought to Harlem to do a specific job had done before in any version of this kind of story that anyone in the neighborhood could recall. He sent a message back. Friday morning, 116th Street. The kind of quiet that comes before something changes direction. April 12th, 1952. Saturday morning. The message that came back from the youngest man, the one with the healed injury, the one whose name Otis had been 70% certain about, was not elaborate. It said, "We'll hear what he has to say." 3 men. Speaking for all 3. Which meant the youngest had spent Friday night converting the other 2 from a position of professional commitment to a position of professional curiosity. That conversion, whatever it had cost him in argument, in explanation, in the careful management of 2 men who had been sent here with a specific mandate from a man, none of them wanted to disappoint. That conversion was its own kind of intelligence. It told Bumpy that the youngest man had influence with the other 2 that exceeded his nominal position in the group. It told him the youngest man was, in some operational sense, the actual center of gravity of this team. He filed that. The meeting was arranged for 10 a.m. The location was a room above a hardware store on 116th Street. Not the hardware store's own back room, a separate space, accessed through a door at the top of a narrow staircase that the hardware store's owner, a man named Solomon, had rented to various parties for various purposes since 1939 without ever asking questions that he didn't want answered. The room was not impressive. This was intentional. 12 feet by 14, a rectangular table, dark wood, old, with a water ring near one end that had been there since before Solomon could remember. 4 chairs, a window facing the back of the building, which meant no view of the street, which meant no easy assessment of what was outside, which meant the three men would be operating without one of the informational advantages that professionals in unfamiliar environments depend on: a single overhead bulb. No pull chain, it was operated by a switch at the door. On the table, a coffee pot, 4 cups, a plate with something covered by a cloth napkin. Nothing else. Bumpy arrived at 9:40, 20 minutes early. He sat in the chair facing the door, not the head of the table, not a power position in the obvious sense, just the chair that faced the entrance, and poured himself coffee and waited. He did not review anything, did not go over what he planned to say, did not rehearse. There was nothing to rehearse. He already knew what he was going to offer. He had known since Thursday morning at the kitchen table, somewhere around his second cup of coffee, when the full shape of the situation had assembled itself in his thinking, and he had seen not just what the problem was, but what the solution looked like, the only solution that accomplished everything simultaneously, the only solution that resolved the immediate situation, sent a message to Mulberry Street more unsettling than any counter-violence could have sent, and served the three men in front of him in a way that might actually hold. He poured his coffee, waited, listened to 116th Street through the window. They arrived at 10:03, 3 minutes late. Not significantly late, not insultingly late, just late enough that they had stood outside for a moment before coming up, which meant they had taken one final opportunity to assess the exterior, to know where the exits were, to confirm one last time that this was not a room they were being led into for purposes other than the stated one. Bumpy heard them on the stairs. He did not stand. He did not look at the door. When it opened, he was looking at the window. He let them enter, let them see the room, the table, the chairs, the covered plate, the coffee. Let them see him sitting with his back to them for the 2 seconds it took to complete his turn, which he completed slowly, without urgency, the way a man turns from a window when he has finished looking at something that interested him and is now ready to attend to the next thing. He looked at them. 3 seconds. Then he gestured at the chairs. "Sit down," he said. "Coffee's hot." Caruso sat first. The tallest one, the one in the brown coat, the surveyor's eyes, sat second, positioning himself slightly angled to the door in a way that was professional reflex. The youngest sat last, directly across from Bumpy, which placed him closest and which Bumpy had anticipated because the youngest understood that this was ultimately his meeting in a way the other two didn't fully grasp yet. Nobody touched the coffee immediately. Bumpy reached forward, lifted the cloth napkin from the plate. Underneath, 4 slices of sweet potato pie from Mabel's. Thursday through Saturday only. He slid the plate to the center of the table. "Philip makes it on Thursdays," Bumpy said. "Better on Saturday. Something about sitting." Nobody moved toward the pie. Bumpy took a slice, ate a small amount, set the fork down. This was the whole first minute. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable in the way most silences between adversaries are uncomfortable. It did not have the quality of 2 sides waiting for the other to show weakness. It had a different quality, the quality of a room in which everyone present understood that the man sitting across from them had already decided something and was now simply allowing time for that decision to become visible at the pace he had chosen. Caruso broke it. "You know why we're here," he said. "Not a question. A confirmation of shared information. A professional's way of skipping the pretense." "I do," Bumpy said. "Then you know what we were sent to do." "I do," Bumpy said again. "A pause." "And you arranged this meeting anyway," Caruso said. Bumpy looked at him for a moment, not with challenge, with the specific quality of attention he gave to things that were accurate but incomplete. "I arranged this meeting," he said, "because what you were sent to do and what you're going to do are 2 different things, and I thought it was worth everyone's time to sit down and understand why." The tall one, the surveyor, shifted slightly in his chair. It was the first physical reaction anyone in the room had produced. Bumpy noted it without acknowledging it. He looked at the youngest man. The youngest man was looking back at him with an expression that contained several things at once: the careful neutrality of a professional in an uncertain situation, and underneath that, something else. Something that had been placed there by 4 words received in a hotel room on Friday afternoon. Something that was neither fear nor gratitude, but existed in the specific register that occupies the space between the two. Recognition. He recognized that he was in a room with a man who had done something that almost no one in either of their worlds ever did. He had looked past the job, past the contract, past the mandate, past the surface of the situation entirely, and had seen the men. "There's a version of this," Bumpy said, "where this conversation doesn't happen. Where I handle what I know the way most men in my position would handle it." He paused. "That version exists. I want you to understand that it exists." He said it without threat, without leaning forward, without any of the theatrical weight that lesser men attach to statements designed to remind others of their vulnerability. He said it as information. Because it was information. And because the 3 men across from him needed to understand the full landscape of the situation, needed to see the other roads before the road he was about to offer them could be properly assessed. Caruso's jaw tightened slightly. The tall one was still. The youngest man didn't move at all. "But that version," Bumpy said, "doesn't serve anybody in this room. And it doesn't serve the people on the street below this building. And when something doesn't serve the people on the street below this building," he picked up his coffee cup, held it, didn't drink. "I tend not to do it." He set the cup down, looked at the window for a moment, then back at the table. "You're professionals," he said. "I respect that. You came up here, you did your work correctly, you were careful with the neighborhood. That matters to me." A pause. "You didn't break anything that didn't need to be broken. That also matters to me." Caruso said, "We were sent here to—" "I know what you were sent here to do," Bumpy said. Quiet. Final. Not a cutoff, a completion. The sentence didn't need the rest of it. The rest of it was already in the room. 4 seconds of silence. Then Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket, produced 3 envelopes, set them on the table, one in front of each man, did not explain them. The youngest man looked at the envelope in front of him, did not touch it. "What is this?" the tall one said. "Open it," Bumpy said. They opened them. Inside each envelope was not money. It was a piece of paper, 1 page, typed, describing a position. A specific role within the operational structure of Bumpy Johnson's Harlem organization, responsibilities, territory, reporting structure. What would be expected? What would be provided in return? Not a bribe, an offer of employment. The silence that followed the opening of the envelopes was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. This one had texture. Caruso read his page twice, set it face down on the table, looked at Bumpy with an expression that was trying very hard to be unreadable and was not entirely succeeding. The tall one read his once, folded it, held it in both hands, said nothing. The youngest man read his, did not fold it, did not set it down, held it in his right hand, and looked at Bumpy with the expression that had been underneath his professional neutrality since he'd walked through the door. "You're offering us jobs," Caruso said. The word jobs landed in the room with the specific weight of a word that does not fit the context it has been placed in, and everyone present knows it. "I'm offering you a reason," Bumpy said. "A pause. A reason to stay. A reason that's better than the one you came up here with. A reason that serves the people below this building instead of disrupting them." He looked at each of them in turn, slowly. "And a reason that, if you think about it carefully," another pause, the longest one, "is better for the man who sent you too, even if he doesn't know it yet." Caruso leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling for a moment, looked at the table, looked at Bumpy. "He's not going to accept this," he said. "He doesn't have to accept it," Bumpy said. "He has to live with it." A pause. "There's a difference," Bumpy said. The tall man put his folded paper in his jacket pocket. Something in that motion, its finality, its quiet decisiveness, shifted the room's balance in a way everyone felt but nobody named. Caruso looked at the youngest man. The youngest man was still looking at Bumpy. The 4 words, the youngest man said. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was lower than expected. Steady. The voice of a man who had spent years training himself to speak only when what he had to say was worth the breath. Bumpy looked at him, waited. How did you know about Baltimore? The youngest man said. A pause. Bumpy picked up his coffee cup, drank, set it down, looked at the youngest man with the full weight of 20 years of reading rooms, reading people, reading the thing underneath the thing that everyone else was busy looking at the surface of. Because, Bumpy said, I make it my business to know what a man is carrying before I ask him to set it down. The room was very quiet. Outside, 116th Street continued its Saturday morning. The sounds of it came through the window in fragments, a horn, a voice, the specific percussion of a city block that has been running the same rhythms for decades and will run them long after every man in this room is gone. Caruso looked at the youngest man. The youngest man nodded. Once. Small. The kind of nod that ends a very long argument that neither side is fully prepared to admit has been won. Caruso looked at Bumpy. We'll need to go back, Caruso said. Handle the situation with the man who sent us. I know, Bumpy said. That won't be simple. I know that too, Bumpy said. That's why I put what I put in those envelopes. So that when you go back and handle it, you have something worth handling it for. A long pause. Caruso nodded, slow, measuring. The nod of a man who has just recalculated something fundamental and is in the process of accepting the new number. He picked up his envelope. Stood. The tall man stood. The youngest man stood last. At the door, Caruso turned back. Bumpy was already looking at the window. Caruso almost said something. Didn't. Turned. Left. Bumpy sat in the room for 11 minutes after they had gone. He finished his coffee, looked at the 3 remaining cups untouched, still full, looked at the pie plate, 3 slices still there, 1 eaten, looked at the window. Outside, Saturday morning continued. He stood, put on his hat, adjusted the brim, level, always level, walked to the door, turned off the light, went downstairs, out onto 116th Street, into the noise and the life and the Saturday morning of a neighborhood that did not know, and would not know for some time, how close it had come to a different kind of morning entirely. He turned east, walked. By noon, the hotel on 112th Street had been checked out of. 3 men, checked out clean, luggage carried, cab called, gone. By Monday morning, the hotel on 112th Street had been stripped of any evidence that 3 men had ever occupied rooms 14, 15, and 16. This was professional habit, not panic. The beds were made not by housekeeping, but by the men themselves, before they left. The ashtrays were clean, the wastebaskets held nothing. Whatever conversations had happened in those rooms had happened without paper, without writing, without anything that could be recovered and read by someone who came looking afterward. They were thorough men. They had been thorough men on the way in. They were thorough men on the way out. The difference was the direction. What happened when they returned south below 110th Street, below 96th, back into the geography that had sent them is a matter of reconstructed account rather than direct testimony. Nobody who was present in that conversation ever described it fully, and the men involved had professional reasons for keeping the details private that outlasted any statute of limitations. But certain things can be established from the edges. Sal received them on a Monday evening. The same room on Mulberry Street, same table, same overhead light on the long cord, different energy, the kind of energy that occupies a room when the men entering it are bringing news that the man at the head of the table is not going to find straightforward. Caruso spoke. He spoke for approximately 20 minutes. By the later account of one man who was positioned outside the room and heard the duration, if not the content, Sal did not interrupt. This was noted. Sal always interrupted. What Caruso told him the shape of it, reconstructed from fragments across several years, was not a story of failure. Caruso was too careful for that. too experienced in the specific art of delivering unwelcome information to powerful men without triggering the kind of reaction that ends careers or, in certain contexts, considerably more than careers. He told it as a negotiation, as an outcome, as a situation that had developed in a direction that none of them had anticipated because the man they had gone to handle had anticipated it first, had prepared for it first, and had this was the part that required the most careful framing had offered something that Caruso believed, professionally and without sentiment, was worth considering. He put the 3 envelopes on the table. Sal looked at them, did not open them immediately, looked at Caruso, looked at the envelopes, picked up the one closest to him. Read it. Set it down. His face, by all reconstructed accounts, did nothing remarkable. This was the most frightening possible response. The silence lasted long enough that Caruso, who had sat across tables from dangerous men in difficult conversations since 1938 and had never been described by anyone as a man who frightened easily, Caruso felt it. Then Sal said something. Nobody outside the room heard what he said. What is known is that the meeting ended 20 minutes later, that all 3 men left the building intact, that Caruso, on the street outside, stood for a moment in the April evening and looked at nothing in particular before turning north toward the subway, and that the contract, the specific, professional arrangement that had been made in that room 2 weeks earlier, the arrangement that had sent 3 men above 110th Street with a specific mandate, was not renewed, not canceled with ceremony, not acknowledged publicly, not discussed again in any room where anyone was keeping records. It simply stopped existing. The way certain decisions stop existing when the man who made them decides that the cost of continuing has exceeded the cost of quietly finding a different position. Harlem received the news the way Harlem received most important news, not through announcement, through absence. The dark blue car did not return to Lenox Avenue. The men in correctly fitted suits did not reappear on the corner of 116th. The particular quality of surveillance that had settled over the neighborhood for 10 days, the watching, the mapping, the careful professional attention lifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, just ceased to be present, the way a sound ceases to be present, noticed most clearly in its removal. By Wednesday of that week, the numbers runners were moving their routes with the specific ease of men who had been carrying a weight they hadn't fully named and had now set it down. By Thursday, Curtis, the barber on 116th, was cutting hair and talking about the baseball season. By Friday, Mabel's was full at breakfast, and Philip was frying eggs, and the woman in the yellow dress was reading a newspaper at the counter, and Gerald was eating his oatmeal, and the radio was playing something instrumental that nobody was really listening to. Everything the way it had been, everything the way it was supposed to be. The 3 men, Caruso, the tall one, the youngest, did not arrive in Harlem simultaneously or with any ceremony. They arrived across several weeks, separately, at intervals that felt natural rather than coordinated, which was itself a kind of coordination that all 3 understood without discussing. Caruso came first. He presented himself to a man named Otis on a Thursday afternoon and stated, in the direct and economical way of someone who had decided on a course of action and saw no reason to surround it with unnecessary language, that he was ready to begin. Otis looked at him for a moment, made a phone call from the back of the hardware store on 116th, came back. Tuesday, Otis said, someone will find you. Caruso nodded, turned, left. No ceremony, no handshake, no acknowledgement of what had preceded this moment, or how unusual it was, or what it meant in the larger architecture of things. Just Tuesday. The tall one came the following week. He had, in the interim, apparently resolved whatever situation existed below 110th Street with a thoroughness that nobody uptown inquired about directly. What was visible was that he arrived in Harlem with nothing following him, no tension, no shadow, no sense of unfinished business trailing behind him like smoke. He was given a territory on the east side of the operation, specific blocks, specific responsibilities, reporting to a man named Raymond, who had been running that section since 1949 and who received his new colleague with the careful, evaluating neutrality of a man who has been told something extraordinary and has decided to reserve judgment until the evidence arrives. The evidence arrived slowly. The tall one was punctual, accurate, did his work without commentary or complaint, treated the people on his route with the specific professional courtesy that Bumpy's operation required of everyone within it, a courtesy that was not warmth exactly, but was genuine, was real, was the courtesy of a man who had been told that the people on these blocks were not a backdrop to the operation but the reason for it, and who had, apparently, taken that information seriously. Raymond revised his judgment upward after 3 weeks. He did not say so to anyone directly. He didn't need to. The youngest came last. He arrived on a Tuesday evening in early May, 6 weeks after the meeting in the room above Solomon's hardware store. He came to a different address, not the hardware store, not Mabel's, not any of the locations that had been part of the preceding week's activity. He came to an address that Bumpy had specified personally through a message delivered through the same indirect channel that had carried the original 4 words to the hotel on 112th Street. It was a small office, 2 rooms, above a tailor's shop on 118th Street. Bumpy was there when he arrived. This meeting was shorter than the one on April 12th. There was no pie, no coffee pot, no envelopes, just 2 men in a room, one of them having traveled a considerable distance, not geographically, but in every other sense that distance can be measured to arrive at this specific moment. They spoke for perhaps 15 minutes. What was said, nobody reported. What was known afterward was that the youngest man, the one with the healed injury, the one whose mother was in Baltimore, the one who had received 4 words in a hotel room and had turned those 4 words into a conversation that had turned a room on 116th Street into something none of the 3 men had expected to walk out of with their lives intact, let alone with a reason to return. That man came out of the tailor's office on 118th Street and stood on the sidewalk in the May evening light, looked up the block, looked down, put his hands in his coat pockets, and stayed. In the weeks that followed, certain things shifted in the operational landscape of Harlem in ways that were visible only to people who had been watching closely enough to notice the before and after. The East Side routes ran cleaner. Certain disputes that had been simmering territorial questions, payout disagreements, the kind of chronic, low-level friction that accumulates in any complex operation over time, got resolved with an efficiency that suggested someone was bringing a specific kind of experience to their adjudication, the kind of experience that comes from having spent years on the other side of exactly these kinds of tensions. The 3 new men knew things about the people who had sent them that Bumpy had not previously known in the level of detail that changes operational decisions. Not intelligence delivered formally, not a transaction, just the natural consequence of men who were now working inside one structure having previously worked inside another. Bumpy never asked for this directly. He never needed to. The information arrived the way all useful information arrived in his world. Organically, quietly, through the normal operation of men doing their jobs correctly. On Mulberry Street, the room above the dry goods importing business continued its after-hours meetings. Sal continued to sit at the head of the table. The envelope, the one he had read on a Monday evening and set back down without expression, was never mentioned again in that room. Whether it had been destroyed, filed, or kept somewhere private was unknown. What was known was that the arrangement between the organization below 110th Street and the operation above it underwent a quiet renegotiation in the summer of 1952. The terms that emerged from that renegotiation were not identical to what had existed before. They were different in Harlem's favor, not dramatically, not in a way that required acknowledgement or ceremony or any visible concession from the men on Mulberry Street. Just different enough, just enough to mean something, just enough to confirm what the 3 envelopes on a table in a back room had already said more clearly than any negotiation could have. You sent 3 men to end something. I gave 3 men a reason to build something. Now, tell me which of us understood this situation better. Nobody on Mulberry Street answered that question out loud. They didn't need to. The answer was already living on 116th Street, going to work every Tuesday. Nobody asked Bumpy Johnson directly what he had been thinking in April of 1952. This was not because people weren't curious. It was because the people who knew him well enough to ask already understood that the question would produce nothing useful, not because he was secretive, but that was not the primary reason. Because Bumpy operated from a position that had no patience for the translation of action into explanation. What he had done was visible. What it meant was visible. A man who needed to explain those things had already lost something in the telling. So nobody asked. And Bumpy never offered. What survives is what his closest people, Otis, Clarence, Raymond, and a handful of others who occupied the inner ring of his operation during those years, what they understood, pieced together over time about what had actually happened and why it had happened the way it did. Not the surface of it, the architecture beneath. The first thing they understood was this: Bumpy had known about the 3 men before most people assumed he had known. Not from Estelle on 115th. Not from the woman named Doris behind the counter on 114th. Not from any of the street-level reporting that had assembled the picture by Wednesday afternoon of that first week. Earlier. How much earlier was never established with precision. But Otis, in a conversation years later, said something that the person he was talking to did not fully absorb until they had sat with it for a while. He wasn't surprised when I told him. Not even a little. I'd been working with him since '44, and I knew what surprised him looked like. That wasn't it. When I told him, he nodded, like I was confirming something he'd already put away. This meant one of 2 things. Either Bumpy had sources below 110th Street that nobody in his operation knew about, sources deep enough to receive information about a commission decision before the operational execution of that decision had begun, or he had simply read the situation correctly, in advance, from the pattern of events leading up to it, from the renegotiation that hadn't resolved, from the message in the fall of 1951 that he had answered with strategic compliance rather than real compliance. From 20 years of understanding how Sal thought and what Sal did when patience finally expired, Otis believed it was the second thing. He didn't need a source, Otis said. He just needed to pay attention. And he always paid attention. The second thing his people understood was the timing. Bumpy had not moved immediately when the information came in. He had waited. 3 full days of knowing or near knowing before the meeting was arranged. 3 days during which the 3 professionals continued their mapping, continued their assessment, continued building their picture of 116th Street, without knowing that the man they were building it around was watching the process with the calm attention of someone who has already decided how the story ends and is now simply allowing it to reach its conclusion at its natural pace. This waiting was not passivity. It was precision. By waiting, he accomplished 3 things simultaneously. First, he allowed the 3 men to complete enough of their work that they felt professionally invested in the situation. Men who have put real work into an assessment have a different relationship to that assessment than men who are simply executing an order. They have opinions, judgments, a sense of what the landscape actually looks like versus what they were told it would look like. By the time the meeting happened, all 3 of them had spent enough time in Harlem to have a real picture of what it was. That picture was not what Mulberry Street had given them. That picture was what the neighborhood itself had given them. Bumpy had let Harlem do part of his work for him. Second, by waiting, he gathered the specific piece of information, the youngest man's history, the Baltimore connection, the debt that predated this particular contract, that turned a dangerous situation into a negotiable one. Without that piece, the meeting on April 12th would have been a different kind of meeting, possibly the last kind. Third, the waiting itself was a message to the 3 men, to the organization that had sent them, to anyone paying close enough attention. A man who knows 3 professionals have come to his neighborhood to end his life, and waits 3 days before responding is not a man who is afraid. He is a man who is operating from a position so secure, so deliberately constructed over so many years, that the arrival of a threat does not alter his timeline. It alters theirs. The third thing, the deepest thing, the one that took the longest to fully understand even for the people closest to him, was the nature of the offer itself. Employment. 3 envelopes. 3 typed pages. 3 specific roles within the operational structure of Bumpy Johnson's Harlem. On the surface, this looked like mercy, or pragmatism, or the particular kind of cold genius that converts enemies into assets. All of those readings had some truth in them, but Otis, who had been present for more of Bumpy's decisions than almost anyone, said the real meaning was something else. It wasn't about those 3 men, Otis said. Not primarily. It was about what Sal would have to do next. Think about what Sal was now facing. He had sent 3 professionals to resolve a situation quietly and permanently. Those 3 professionals had come back intact, unharmed, and employed by the man they had been sent to remove. They were now inside Bumpy's operation, working, present, on 116th Street every week, which meant that Sal could not send anyone else. Not easily, not quietly, because now any move against Bumpy Johnson was also a move against 3 men who had previously worked for Sal's organization. 3 men who, presumably, knew things, who had been inside room, who had information about the organization below 110th Street that they were now positioned very close to a man who would find it useful. The employment offer had not just converted 3 threats into assets. It had constructed a wall. Any aggression from Mulberry Street now carried the risk of those 3 men deciding out of self-preservation, out of loyalty, out of the simple arithmetic of survival, to share what they knew. Bumpy had not threatened this. He had not said a word about it. He hadn't needed to. He had simply created the condition and allowed Sal to do the mathematics himself. This was the message behind the message. You can't move against me without moving against your own people, and your own people are now my people. So tell me how you'd like to proceed. There was a 4th layer. This one, Otis didn't articulate directly. It came through in the spaces between what he said, in the way he paused before certain words, in the way he looked away when certain subjects approached. Bumpy had been in Alcatraz. Not yet. In April 1952, that would come 2 years later. But the possibility of it was already present. Federal attention to organized crime in New York was increasing. The Kefauver hearings had concluded the previous year. The machinery that would eventually take Bumpy off 116th Street for 9 years was already in motion, even if its final shape wasn't yet visible. Bumpy knew this. He knew that the thing he had built, the operation, the community infrastructure, the 40-block system that functioned as bank and court and protective mechanism simultaneously, he knew that it could not survive on his presence alone. That if something removed him, even temporarily, the structure needed to be strong enough to hold without him at the center of it. 3 men who understood both worlds, who had come from Mulberry Street and were now embedded in Harlem, were not just operational assets. They were structural reinforcement. Men who understood what the organization below 110th Street was capable of, and who were now invested in making sure it stayed below 110th Street, were exactly the kind of people a system needed in the positions closest to its edges. Bumpy was not just solving the problem of April 1952. He was building for 1954. For the 9 years, he would be gone. For the Harlem that would need to hold itself together without him. This was what nobody on Mulberry Street had understood. And this was why the difference between them was not a difference of power or intelligence or ruthlessness. It was a difference of what they were building toward. Sal was managing an empire, consolidating territory, maximizing extraction from every operation under his influence. His time horizon was the next quarter, the next year, the next negotiation. Bumpy was building a community. His time horizon was decades. His time horizon was the boy on the overturned crate outside Mabel's, who took a folded bill, without asking who it was from. His time horizon was the numbers runner who could afford to keep his family in their apartment because the payout came when it was supposed to come. His time horizon was the 40 blocks that needed to still be standing, still functioning, still serving its people, after whatever the federal government was assembling in its files had run its course. You cannot defeat that kind of thinking with 3 professionals and a contract. You can only, eventually, recognize it for what it is and make room. Otis was asked once, in the years after everything had settled after Alcatraz, after the return, after 1968, and everything that word implies, whether he thought Bumpy had planned it exactly the way it unfolded, whether the 3 envelopes had existed before the 3 men arrived in Harlem, whether the whole sequence had been, from the beginning, a performance of uncertainty concealing a completely predetermined outcome. Otis thought about it for a long time. Then he said, he knew the offer he was going to make before they came up from the subway. He knew it before Sal made the decision in that room downtown. He knew it because he understood what those men were before he ever saw their faces. A pause. He just needed to wait until they understood what they were too. 116th Street. May 1952. The numbers runners moved their routes. The coffee at Mabel's was strong enough to offend people who weren't from Harlem. Philip made the pie on Thursdays. It was better on Saturday. Something about sitting. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson died on July 7th, 1968. He was 62 years old. He was sitting at a table at Wells Restaurant on West 116th Street, playing cards with men he had known for decades, in a neighborhood he had spent 40 years protecting, shaping, and refusing to abandon even when abandonment would have been the safer choice. He ordered fried chicken. He was dealt a hand. He never finished either one. A heart attack. Sudden. The doctors would say later that it had probably been building for years, that a body carrying what his had carried, through what his had been through, accumulates a kind of debt that eventually presents itself for collection, regardless of what the man attached to it has left undone. He was surrounded by people who knew him. He died the way he had lived, in the middle of something, on 116th Street. The news moved through Harlem the way all important news moved through Harlem, without announcement. By the time the official word had reached the newspapers, the brief, carefully managed notices that reduced a life of extraordinary complexity to 4 column inches of biography, the neighborhood had already been sitting with it for hours, already processing it in the specific, private way of people who have lost something they didn't fully name while they had it. The barber shop on 116th was quiet that morning. Not closed. Open. Curtis behind the chair, customers in their seats. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that is not absence of sound, but presence of weight. Gerald came into Mabel's at his regular time, ordered his oatmeal, his black coffee, sat at the counter, didn't read the paper, just sat. Philip fried eggs behind the window. The radio played something instrumental. Nobody was really listening. In the years that followed, the story of April 1952 did not appear in newspapers. It did not appear in court records, in federal files, in any of the documented accounting of organized crime in New York during that period. The men involved had professional reasons for keeping it private that outlasted their careers and, in some cases, their lives. The commission below 110th Street had no interest in memorializing a situation that had resolved in the way it had resolved. The federal government had never known it happened. It lived where Harlem's most important stories always lived, in the oral tradition, in the barber shop, in the beauty parlor, in the back booth of a diner, where 2 people who had been there or who knew someone who had been there would occasionally, carefully, in the right company, with the right level of trust established, tell the part of it they knew. The story assembled itself over decades, the way a mosaic assembles itself piece by piece, from different hands, none of them holding the complete picture, all of them contributing something true. What Harlem remembered about April 1000 952 was not the threat. Threats had come before. Threats would come again. The history of Harlem's relationship with the organized crime interests below 110th Street was long and complicated and contained chapters far more violent, far more publicly dramatic than three men checking into a hotel on 112th Street for a week in the spring. What Harlem remembered was the response. Or rather, what Harlem remembered was the quality of the response, the specific texture of it, the way it had resolved a situation that could have resolved in blood and noise, and the kind of disruption that leaves marks on a neighborhood for years, resolved it instead in 3 typed pages and a plate of sweet potato pie, and a conversation that ended with 3 men walking out of a room, alive and employed. This was the thing that passed through the oral tradition, not as a story of power, though it was that, but as a story of a particular kind of intelligence that the neighborhood recognized as its own. He thought, further than they did, was how one man put it, years later, to a person who was asking about Bumpy Johnson for reasons the man didn't fully understand yet. Not smarter. Further, they were thinking about that week. He was thinking about the next 10 years. The 3 men themselves became part of the neighborhood's texture in ways that varied by the individual. Caruso stayed for 4 years, left in 1956 for reasons that were never fully explained but were accepted without friction, which itself said something about the terms under which he had been operating. He was not remembered as a former enemy. He was not remembered with suspicion or with the particular guarded quality that attaches to men whose loyalties are considered permanently provisional. He was remembered as a man who had done his work correctly. That was the highest available assessment on 116th Street. The tall one, whose name had never been fully established in the neighborhood's accounting, was gone by 1955. Where he went, nobody tracked. He had been present. He had been reliable. He had disappeared quietly. In the operational world, both above and below 110th Street, quiet disappearances were not necessarily ominous. Sometimes they were simply men making new calculations about where they needed to be. The youngest stayed the longest. He was still in Harlem in 1954 when Bumpy was taken to Alcatraz. Was part of the structure that held the operation together during the 9 years of Bumpy's absence, a structure that bent considerably during those years, that lost ground in certain directions, that faced pressures from below 110th Street that were emboldened by the removal of the man who had made those pressures expensive, but held imperfectly, incompletely, with losses that Bumpy would spend years after his 1963 return assessing and addressing. But held. The youngest man was one of the reasons it held. Whether Bumpy had known, in April 1952, that this specific man would become this specific kind of load-bearing element in the years of his absence, whether the offer in the 3rd envelope had been calibrated with that future in mind, was something nobody ever asked directly, and Bumpy never offered. When Bumpy returned from Alcatraz in 1963, he walked back into Harlem the way Otis had once described him walking into any room. Without announcement, the neighborhood made way. There were no celebrations, no ceremony, no gathering on the street to mark the return of a man who had been gone for 9 years and who had, in his absence, become something that living people rarely become, a myth with a pulse. A story that people told while the subject of it was still breathing somewhere, still capable of walking into a room and making the myth suddenly, uncomfortably, wonderfully concrete. He sat at the second table from the back at Mabel's. Loretta, older now, the careful stillness of a woman who had spent a decade learning a room and had never unlearned it, brought coffee without being asked. He wrapped both hands around the cup, looked at the door, looked at the window facing Lenox Avenue, drank his coffee. He was home. What does a story like this mean decades later? Not as history, not as crime biography, not as the kind of cautionary tale that organizes a life into lessons for the consumption of people who want their complexity pre-digested. What does it mean as a story about power? This is what Harlem had understood in 1952, what it had been understanding for the 20 years before that, and what it continued to understand in all the decades that followed. Power that announces itself is power that has already begun to negotiate with its own vulnerability. A man who needs you to know he is powerful has already told you something about where his power ends. Bumpy Johnson never announced himself. He walked into rooms, and the rooms changed. He sent messages that arrived as actions, not words. He built structures that outlasted his presence, that held imperfectly, humanly, but held through 9 years of his physical absence. He converted 3 men, sent to end him, into 3 reasons his operation continued. He looked at a threat and saw, underneath it, 3 human beings carrying histories that predated the contract they had been given, and he addressed the histories instead of the contract. This was not mercy. It was precision. The most precise thing a powerful man can do is understand, completely, what he is actually looking at, not what he has been told to look at, not what the surface presents, what is actually there, underneath, weight-bearing, waiting to be seen by whoever is paying the right kind of attention. Bumpy Johnson paid the right kind of attention. For 40 years, on 116th Street, in the second table from the back, with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that was strong enough to offend people who weren't from Harlem. Some men leave buildings behind. Some men leave silence. Bumpy Johnson left both. He left the silence of a neighborhood that knew how to keep its most important stories inside itself, in the oral tradition, passed from mouth to ear in barber shops and diners, and the back rooms of hardware stores on Saturday mornings. And he left the building not brick and mortar, but the thing that brick and mortar is supposed to be in service of: the structure, the 40 blocks, the informal economy that served the people the official economy had declined to serve, the system of accountability and loyalty and consequence that made a community function when the city surrounding it had decided functioning wasn't its concern. That was the building. That was what he left. That was what 3 men from Mulberry Street had been sent to demolish without understanding what they were swinging at. Nobody said his name too loud. Not on 116th. Not in 1952. Not in 1968. Not now. You just knew. The way you know it's going to rain. The way you know when a room has changed before anyone in it has moved. The way you know when a story has been passed to you carefully, in the right company, with the right level of trust, you know it's true. Not because it was documented, because it sounds exactly like him. Some stories get written down. Some stories get lived into the walls of a neighborhood, until the walls themselves remember. 116th Street remembers. Subscribe if you want to understand why.